First story. My dad was betrayed by my mom, his best friend's stepfather, and they told me lies. My father was abusive, causing me to resent him. Then I overhear them admitting their affair and laughing about ruining his life. Now that mom is having a breakdown, I cut ties with her and move closer to my dad. English is not my first language. My mom had been married to my dad for 9 years before she cheated and left him for his best friend, who is my stepdad. My father served in the army, and his best friend was this rich guy who I saw hanging out with my mom at that time. During the divorce, my mom told me that my dad was abusive, controlling, and not there emotionally. That's why she was leaving him. She told me that my dad treated her badly, called her names, and did not love her. At the time, I was only 10 years old. My mom got primary custody, and my dad was stuck paying child support. I only get to see my dad on 2 weekends per month. After that, I held some resentment towards my dad. I dreaded when it was time to see him. He had sold what used to be our house, moved back to his hometown, opened a mechanic shop, and lived in this shop. He was an alcoholic who always tried to sober up when I came to stay with him. He was miserable, lonely, and depressed. He always tried to clean up his house when I went to stay with him, even though it still smelled like alcohol, gunpowder, gasoline, and those car oils. And sometimes I found dirty laundry stacked in the laundry room. When I turned 15, I started to see him less. I refused to go stay with him and made up excuses. I only visited him a few times a year. One day, I went to visit him without informing him. I found him drinking while watching a football game. He was surprised to see me. He quickly started getting rid of his beer cans, cleaning his kitchen, and asking if I was hungry so that he could order pizza. I just lashed out at him and told him that's why mom left him. He was so miserable and could keep his SHT together. I felt guilty afterwards. He loves old classic muscle cars, and when I turned 18, he got me a 1970 Chevrolet SS, which he had fixed himself. Later, me and my mom sold it and got a Honda Civic. Anyway, last week, I came to visit my mom. I was planning to stay for the weekend. On Saturday night, I overheard my mom and my stepdad talking about what happened 12 years ago, bragging about their affair, and not once even regretting how it affected my dad. All they said was that they felt sorry for him. I couldn't help but cry. I wanted to confront her, but I couldn't bring myself. I wanted to call her names and insult her, but I didn't have the strength. I was full of mixed emotions, but I felt guilty the most. All this time, I held resentment towards my dad, thinking he was the bad guy. But he was only the victim of my mom's affair. He never recovered from the affair due to his depression and anxiety issues. And all the time I thought he faked caring about me. He genuinely cared for me, and he always tried to stay strong and smile for me. I left the following day, found my dad at his mechanic shop, and hugged him. I was crying, and he was puzzled, and I kept saying sorry repeatedly. When he managed to calm me down, I told him everything, and I apologized even more. And when I asked why he didn't fight my mom for my custody, he told me that he knew that his depression and anxiety issues, plus his PTSD, would make him an unfit parent. And he never wanted to ruin the relationship between me and my mom because he knew I loved her. And his ex-best friend loved me and would take care of me more than he would. He said that it was not my fault and forgave me. And he was happy I found out. I want to make it up to my dad, but I don't know how. Please help. TLDR. Mom cheated and left dad for his best friend. I made him look bad, and I grew resentful towards him. Now I want to make it up to him. Comments. You're a source. Just continue to love him and be a good daughter. That's all he wants. Commenter. Damn, what a effed up story. And that your mom is laughing about what she did with your dad until today is just disgusting. The muscle car you sold, could you buy that back? I think that your dad would be very happy if you arrived with that car in front of his store. Then plan a weekend with him. If he likes to go fishing, then do that. Just spend as much time together as possible. Oh, and please kick your mom and stepdad in the arse for me. They destroyed a life, not for their own sake, but only because they were cowards, and they remember that time until today with a smile on their faces. Excuse me, please. I need to go and vomit. Update Automod, 20 days later. Sorry for the late update. It's a bit long, but a few of you insisted I update them. First, thanks to all those who took the time to comment and offer support. As some of you said, there are two sides to every story, and I decided to listen to my dad's side. He admitted to being distant and not affectionate after his last deployment due to his PTSD, but the affair had been going on when he was in deployment. I confronted my mom a few days later, after my post, and she was defensive at first. She said that I was not grateful for what she did for me, and that she simply protected me from my father. She called him a few names. I didn't want to argue, and I had already chosen my next words carefully. I told her that my father was a good man who was broken by the betrayal of the two people he trusted the most. And worst of all, you turned his own daughter against him. I appreciate and am grateful for everything. But it's time I chose the parent who puts his own daughter's needs first, even if it means making hard sacrifices, and not the one who wants the daughter to satisfy her own needs. Goodbye, Mom. I will keep in touch. Before I left, tears had been building in her eyes, and she just remained silent. She has tried to reach out to me, but I just ignore her or ask her to stop disturbing me. I don't want to block her, but my message is loud and clear. My aunt has recently reached out to me and told me that my mom is depressed. Well, her husband can take care of her. As for my dad, most of you suggested I sell a Civic and buy the Chevy SS back. I couldn't find the person I sold it to, but I decided to look for old, worn-out muscle cars to fix. I have been searching for a while. It was hard, but I had the help of a few friends and even some Redditors who reached out to me on chat. Almost 2 weeks ago, I was lucky and found an old, wrecked 1970 Dodge Charger. And yeah, I sold the Civic to afford the Charger. My dad was kind of upset, but when I told him the reason, he brightened up. He's been more than happy to show me how to fix it. I bought an apartment an hour away from his mechanic shop. One Redditor suggested I do a makeover at his place. Well, I have been making time, and we have started to renovate and do a makeover. And my friends from college who are studying interior design have decided to help. It took him a little convincing, as he felt embarrassed, but he finally joined the train. Now, every day after college, I go to visit him, and on weekends, I spend time with him and talk about anything, mostly because he's interested in my life. He likes soccer and is a big fan of Arsenal. So I always keep him company during match days, pick the opponent team to add fun, and I'm learning a little of football. Since I sold my car, he has allowed me to use his 1977 Pontiac Firebird. He has been with it since I was 11, and as long as I can remember, he has never let anyone drive it. Since I have been around more often, he has stopped his drinking habits maybe a few, and I join him on game nights. But who can blame us? So there is your update. If you made it this far, I guess it is a happy ending. Thanks to all of you again. Comments. Deleted commenter. The joy you brought into your father's life is amazing. OP, I know. It's the only thing I'm focusing on. Lord of Thulland. I'm normally not one to say nice things on the internet, but you sound like an incredibly kind and intelligent person. I guarantee your dad is so proud of you. Second story. Entitled foster parents stole my parents' money and spent it on their golden child. So I obliterated their reputation in our small town and cut ties with them after I turned 18. My parents were both killed in a hit-and-run car accident when I was 10. My dad was only 39, and my mom was 35. Neither of them had relatives who could take me in. We lived in a really small, church-going town where everyone knew one another. My dad had been the heir to a small fortune, so he didn't really have to work. He didn't like the big city, so he and my mom decided to move to a small town where he could have an antique store. My mom was into collecting antiques. I would have had to go the orphanage route when they died. But this couple from the church, who I will call Mr. and Mrs. Banks, made this big to-do in church about how a little girl needs a loving home, and God has given us this joyous task of bringing her up in our home and hearts. It's been a long time, and I don't remember if those were Mrs. Banks' exact words, but they were something cringe-worthy like that. The Banks had their own daughter, Kitty, who was a year older than me. That should have meant we would be super good friends, but Kitty had her own thing going and practically ignored me. She was a holier-than-thou type. The Banks received a stipend from the state to take care of me, but they also received checks every month from my dad's estate, which was supposed to take care of me until I was 18. When I did turn 18, I would receive full control of my inheritance. The Banks weren't exactly cruel to me, but in private, it was clear they were just using me to build up their reputation in town. In front of other people, they'd fawn over me in a sick, cotton candy fashion that made me uncomfortable. They'd also make Kitty be nice to me in public, which she resented. The Banks would also put on a big show whenever social workers came to check up on me. They'd coach me before the lady would come and tell me to praise how godly and wonderful they were. After the social worker left, they'd go right back to ignoring me and spending my dad's money on crap on the internet or on trips. It was clear to me, even as a tween and teen, that the Banks were only using some of my endowment, both from the state and from my trust, to take care of me. The rest they spent on themselves. As I grew older, I could see that my foster parents would pretend as though they had great business acumen. And that's why they had more money and could buy a new Volvo where I'm from. A new Volvo is an event, and take a trip to New York and buy fancy clothes for Kitty. When I was 17, I noticed that my foster parents were stockpiling away my trust fund money to pay for Kitty's tuition to college. Throughout this time, the banks would never outright say so, but would heavily imply that I owed them, and that once I got control of my inheritance, I should be godly and generous and give them some material compensation for all the work they did to raise me. I think they already have lots of material, especially since Mrs. Banks practically stole all of my mom's antiques from her store and kept them for herself, gave them to Kitty, or gave them to her other relatives. One thing my mom never kept at her store was an extremely expensive, Baroque-era fine china set, absolutely complete and worth tens of thousands of dollars. Not a replica, but the real deal. So real, Napoleon Bonaparte himself might well have eaten a steak off those plates. Probably not, but you get the point. It was my china set, of course, but Mrs. Banks thought I was an idiot and didn't know that. She would always talk about how, this china set will go to Kitty on her wedding day. Mrs. Banks assumed that since I always dressed like a tomboy and didn't care about all my mom's antiques that Mrs. Banks stole or gave away, I just didn't care about the china set. When I was a kid, my mom told me that things were things and not to obsess over them. So, having the frou-frou china set for myself wasn't an issue. What was an issue was Mrs. Banks acting like it was hers to give away. Wrong, lady. So, once Kitty went off to college thanks to my biological mom and dad's money, I had to make my own plans. I had always done well in school and had actually gotten a partial scholarship to attend school out of state. The rest I could easily pay for with my inheritance, which I would very soon have control of. Per usual, Mr. and Mrs. Banks were haranguing me about how I owed them compensation, and since I was going to be rich soon, I ought to share the wealth. I figured that over the past 7 years, they probably stole or misappropriated more than $200,000 of my parents' money, to say nothing of the state money they misused. I think they more than shared the wealth. I never promised anything. I just smiled and kept a tally of every single bank statement I got them quarterly that my trust issued over the years. The bank's family never shared them with me, of course. But when I asked the actual bank for a rundown, they were more than happy to oblige. I also wrote down every single major purchase my foster parents clearly made over the past 7 years with money that was clearly beyond their means as a housewife and an insurance salesman. Things such as a $40,000 car for cash, a used $20,000 car for cash that they gave to Kitty, trips to Hawaii and New York, cash gifts to the church that made them look super generous at my deceased parents' expense. I kept it all in a nice 3-ring binder. I already arranged my travel to my new campus. I didn't have much stuff at the bank's house anyway, and had zero intention of coming back, at least to their home. The bankers knew I was leaving, but didn't bother seeing me off, because they assumed I'd come back to give them their due. I waited for our church's yearly antique sale extravaganza, set to begin in 3 days. Per usual, the banks donated all sorts of random stuff, many of it knickknacks that used to belong to my mom and technically belonged to me. They weren't shy about giving away my stuff and taking credit for it. While Mr. and Mrs. Banks were on one of their shopping sprees with my parents' money and away from their house, I boxed up the china set and brought it to church. I told the rummage sale committee that Mrs. Banks wanted to donate the priceless antiques for sale. All the benefits would go to the church. This donation is made in the name of Mr. and Mrs. Banks. I was being fair. If Mrs. Banks was really so godly, she would be delighted that such a wonderful donation be made in her name. Sadly, I knew she'd go the other way because she was faker than adult star implants. The ladies were flabbergasted, especially when I told them the appraisal of the set's value. I also told them that if they needed proof of ownership and the right to sell, they should contact the number of a certain attorney in New York. They thanked me profusely and praised the Lord Jesus for Mrs. Banks' generosity. This would be the most expensive item in their sales history. Everyone knew no one could afford to buy the set outright, but everyone would love to buy the pieces piecemeal. Like, I got a cup and saucer, or I got one of the chargers, I got an egg cup. The banks were supposed to work the sale the second day, and I wasn't there. What I did hear was that my foster mom went ballistic when she saw her china set for sale, and that it was a huge hit, and ladies from all over the county had bought pieces of it, and it raised so much money for the church. My foster mom threw a tantrum and said that I had stolen the set from her house. The ladies at the church explained that I had made the donation in her name. and she was getting credit for the donation to the church. My foster mom was practically yanking her hair out, according to what I heard later. She was trying to track down who had bought pieces and get them back. Of course, she was unsuccessful. What she was successful at was looking like a grade A douchebag. The entire church thought she was selfish and materialistic and acting very ungodly, especially the way she cursed her foster daughter. A week later, my foster parents received a package by registered mail from me and my attorney. It contained my binder, where I showed my bank statements and also a list of all their spending extravagances. It also contained a warning from my attorney that should they ever try to contact me again for money, they will receive a bill and a court date. That was 10 years later. I work as a third-grade teacher. I'm married to an accountant, and we have a 3-year-old son and a 1-year-old daughter. Kitty ended up working through college, and as we've gotten older, we've reconnected. She apologized for the way she acted when we were kids. We're friends now, and we see each other multiple times a year, often just for lunch. She's an elementary school teacher too, and she's married to an engineer. She has a 4-year-old daughter. Both of our older kids play together when our families meet. We both have our own wedding china. She has gone to a lot of therapy due to her toxic parents, she tells me. As for her parents, they still live in their small town because they're too broke to move. Their reputation is that of that couple who drove both their children away and stole money from that poor little girl whose parents died. And they tried to steal money from Jesus when they whined about getting their Baroque china back. I hope your Volvo was worth it. A holes. Third story. My entitled Phil moved into our house for a few days after his wife kicked him out. It's been over a month now, and he says he doesn't have any intention of moving out. My husband stayed silent, so I gave him his ring and moved out. My husband 35M and I 33F have been living together in a 2-bedroom apartment for 2+ years now. Recently, his mother kicked his father 70 out. My husband had his father move in with us into our 2-bedroom apartment. I was told it would be a few days, maybe a few weeks. It's been over a month, and since then, his father has said that he has no intention of moving out. Important note: his father is on the lease along with my husband, as this apartment has been in the family. He has taken over our guest me office, and other than coming home drunk and trying to explain his side, he has kept to himself and apologized. He has not been paying rent, but my husband wants to talk to him about splitting rent 3 ways. We are stuck either moving out and moving in with his mother, renting another place, me moving back in with my folks, or buying a house that, quite honestly, I don't think that we can afford right now. We live in a major city where costs are out of control. I feel uncomfortable and like I can't relax. My husband says I am the one most unhappy with the current arrangement. I have told my husband I am considering moving in with my folks for a while, and he is upset. My parents and friends are pressuring me to move out, but I feel like I am about to blow up my relationship over what my husband considers to be an inconvenience. I feel heartless for being upset because I know his father is in a tough spot too. Am I being unreasonable and wrong for being upset? And is it bad that I want some space on the issue? Edit. Hi everybody. I just want to say thank you so much for all your advice and assistance. You've given me a lot to think about. To be clear, if his father was ill or incapable of caring for himself, it would be a whole other conversation. I fully believe in caring for one's family and loved ones when they need help, and I hope I don't sound heartless. My husband and I sat down and decided that I would move back in with my folks, and he would move in with his mom in the short term. His dad will keep the apartment. I'm heartbroken. We are still together, but we will no longer live together for a while. In addition, I feel guilty that I couldn't be patient or strong and suck it up and just be okay with the setup. Update. Well, we're in the process of moving out. My husband will move in with his mother, and I am moving in with my folks. My father-in-law is officially in the apartment, and we are still finishing packing. He will be finding a roommate and will be keeping some of our furniture, but that is a small trade for peace of mind. His dad has said some rude things, like, "Don't blame me if you split up," but outside of that, I haven't really spoken to him. I ended up going away for 2 weeks by myself, and it was really great to work on rebuilding my identity outside of being in this relationship. I really enjoy being alone. I've also been looking at cheap homes for sale, just so that I can have something I call mine. This is not feasible because neither my husband nor I have the money together, but it gives me something to dream about. My husband and I have been speaking every day. We're still together, but he said some things to me in the fallout that I'm struggling with. Specifically, our connection must not be that deep if you're leaving. He has since taken it back and said I am not to blame for any of this. He is excited to focus on parts of his life that he feels he has neglected. So overall, I think he's feeling okay. We're still together, but I'm worried that my moving out means the end of our relationship. Neither of us wants this, but it has become clear to me that he would rather displace me and him than deal with family conflict. I am not used to standing up for myself, but I refuse to be a doormat on this. Our emotions are all over the place, but we're figuring it out. I've also come across a bunch of articles about how men his father's age are finding themselves alone because the women in their lives are no longer willing to put up with their bullshit, which makes sense. Not much to add. If anyone has suggestions for how to navigate or what comes next, I would appreciate it. Thank you all for your support and for really helping me see that I was not fully in the wrong, as I had been guilted to believe. Relevant comments from the OP. I think, to a certain extent, women are starting to realize that the lives their mothers or grandmothers lived are no longer feasible, and men weren't trained to expect this. So while women bear so much of the brunt of emotional labor, we are no longer able or willing to, and men haven't learned how to adapt. For anyone who likes songs about female rage, Labor by Paris Paloma has been on repeat for the whole month for me. Update 2. 9 months after the last update. We lived separately from June to March. With us officially moving out in September, it took us a while. His dad started throwing my things into trash bags during the actual move because I was taking too long to pack. Then, when I started crying because our home was being dismantled, he tried to comfort me as his dad huffed and puffed at my emotions. I took a vacation with my parents, and it took me a month to go away by myself. He joined me for a week. We still met up almost every weekend to spend time together and bond. We still talked every day, but then my gal friend and I took a 2-week vacation that I extended by a whole month. I invited him to join for some, and he declined. On our last night together before I left, we got into a fight about how I seemed distracted. This resulted in me sobbing alone in his mother's basement for an hour. We made up, but it still stuck with me. I learned a lot about myself on this trip. I traveled, met new people, tried new foods, and did things that I used to only dream about. Alone. I did it by myself, and it felt so good to reclaim my identity. My friends said I was glowing like they hadn't seen in years. While I was away on my trip, he checked in, but things felt different, at least for me. Didn't call me or offer to call, not even on my birthday. But that's on me too. The telephone works 2 ways. I came home. We saw each other that weekend, and were discussing plans for the future. I mentioned that I wanted to go back a few months later this year, and he fell silent. I admit, I shouldn't have brought this up at all, but I felt it was disingenuous not to mention it, because this is what I wanted to do with my future. He stayed silent on the way home, got out of my car, and told me not to come in. I got emotional and babbled about losing myself in the relationship, and I realized I needed a step back. I asked him for a break. He said, okay, and slammed the door. I took the time to think. He called me, saying he spoke to a therapist, didn't want to lose me, and that he was so sorry, and he would do better. This weekend, he came over to my parents' house with flowers. I cooked us a meal, we ate together, and we talked. Then I told him I couldn't do it anymore. He asked when I stopped loving him, and I told him the truth. I loved him, and I'm still in love with him, and that's what made this so difficult. I'd been fighting for months. I missed myself, and she was finally back. We'd both been growing, but separately. He said that his parents' relationship shouldn't have an effect on us. I told him that they didn't, but the choices made after did. He told me he'd be willing to break up and wait for a few months, but I also can't promise him something I can't guarantee myself in the future. I gave him back the rings. We spent the night together, crying, reminiscing, and laughing. I love him. I will always love him. I want to be with him, but I can't right now. Actions have repercussions that we don't always see until we hit the breaking point. I'm so heartbroken. Could I have done more, been more, or done something? How do I convince myself that I did the right thing? Did I do the right thing? I just wanted to give the update that no one asked for or wanted. But my marriage is over, I think for good. Y'all were right. How do I pick up the pieces? Thank you for watching the video. If you are interested in listening to these kinds of stories, we've got more in store for you. Simply subscribe to our channel, hit the like button, and share it with your friends.